Hey, my name is Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we get into what I want to talk about this week, I want to do a little something in the intro here. Two things, actually. First, I want to let you know that I released another artist interview, this time with an artist who goes by the screen name Andrew Cockroach, over on Instagram primarily, but also on ArtStation and kind of universally. And if you're interested in that interview and you like that interview by the end, I encourage you to check out the other two art interviews that you can watch that I've done so far, and that is one with Phil Tomato. Once again, he's Phil Tomato across the board, and Jessica Luna, who actually goes by the screen name Eat Slugs across the board. But if that's still not enough for you, you can go over to my site, which is called bento-box.ghost.io, and you can read an interview I did with Hiromi Wakabayashi and Hiroyuki Maishi of Studio Trigger, all about the process of making the new Panty and Stocking with Garter Belt show that was just on Amazon Prime. So if you're interested in any of that, go check that out. A link to bento-box.ghost.io, where you can find all of it in the form of posts, is in the description of this episode. It's also where you can find any external social links. If you're listening to this as a podcast, as a formal podcast, you can find that link in the description of every episode. And the next thing I want to do is offer up a thesis statement for why I'm doing this. And I feel like I want to do this because I'm trying to do something slightly different than normal. And to understand that, let me explain. Most of the time when you're watching an anime influencer, or an influencer at all, they're driven by the views, by the engagement with what they're doing, and all this stuff, because they have linked their livelihoods to this thing. It is their career. This is a side thing for me. It always has been, and I've been really conscious of not making it my main deal for a particular reason. And that is because I don't want to be tied to talking about the most popular thing or finding a unique way to present the stuff I am presenting to you. What I started doing the podcast, which is what I originally just did, for is to change my relationship with the shows I watch, and in particular the anime I was watching. I wanted to think differently and more critically about what I was watching, and also I wanted to give those opinions back to the fandom and the community through an audio medium that I've now upgraded, obviously, into a video medium. But the thesis I've developed since starting this is that I don't want to be like a traditional influencer. What I want to do for you, the listener, the viewer, or even the reader, is I want to act almost as a curator. And this was a big term that was flying around a bunch of years ago at this point. But what I mean is I don't want to just focus on big shonen action shows or big popular clickbaity shows. Although I will talk about those, but if I am going to talk about them, I want to talk about them in a way that demonstrates the usefulness of somebody who's been watching for decades, who's been watching anime and related media for decades. Because I have been watching for decades. And that gives me a perspective that's different from the new hot thing, but also a perspective that's necessarily different from people who are trying to game the system because they have to, because it's their job. It alarms me a little that so much of my audience, you guys, probably know the in-speak of influencers. I don't think that's useful. I think, and when I think about what I want to add to the conversation, whatever it may be, or the, like, morass of, and I hate this word, content out there, it's curating ideas about shows where it almost doesn't matter if the show's bad or good. It's what I find interesting about the show, and what I think you might find interesting about the show. If you really like any of this, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast if you're listening to this, wherever you listen, and leave a 5-star review. That really helps the show. But also, if you're watching this, go ahead and subscribe to the YouTube channel, and on your way doing that, like the video and leave a comment and ring the bell, especially the bell, so you know when new episodes come out. And if you don't want to ring the bell, but you'd still like to know that, they come out every Thursday around 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But the reason I want you to do that is twofold. First, I do want to play a little bit of that influencer game, because that gives me the ability to act as a curator of shows and properties to more people, and to expand people's horizon of this medium of entertainment. But it also lets me build a platform for the artists I'm talking to, since I don't plan on stopping talking to artists, and exposing you, the viewer/listener, to great new artists you may have never heard of before. And on that note, let's jump into what we're talking about this week, and that is a little show from this summer season, and that show is The Secrets of the Silent Witch. Now, without further ado, let me throw it over to who's going to give us a nice little plot summary, so I can just jump into my thoughts about the show. So, take it away,
In a world of swords and sorcery, the exceedingly shy Monica Everett has made a name for herself by being the only person to wield incantationless magic, as well as having a unique understanding of how magic works. She quickly becomes one of the world's best magicians, and is named one of the 7 sages, the 7 most gifted witches and warlocks in her world. Despite her genius, however, her social anxiety, rooted in deep trauma, drives her to withdraw from society all but entirely. One day, her fellow sage Louis Miller the Barrier Mage pays her mountain cabin a visit. Now, under the orders of the king, this social anxiety-ridden genius must go undercover at a prestigious school for nobles to guard second Prince Felix from assassination.
Now that we've got the plot synopsis out of the way, let's talk about geniuses and the entire concept of geniuses. And to do that, I want to liken it to kind of a different kind of thing, because geniuses are, let me put it this way, fiction likes to oftentimes depict geniuses as lone figures, as completely individual figures who can do things that other people can't. But the most interesting depiction of geniuses are not as lone figures. They are when they are held up alongside other people who can stand next to them, when they're held up alongside their peers. And to talk about this, I want to talk about actually something I've been doing that I mentioned in the intro of this episode. I'll probably be mentioning in the intros for a little while now, and that's my interviews with artists. Because part of the reason why I'm doing that is because I think I can offer a very interesting perspective there, because I have been a creative professional for my entire adult life. I've always worked in the creative industries, to some degree in some way, shape, or form. I've had 2 separate careers doing that, but I don't have like your standard business degree. I have an explicitly fine arts and graphic design degree. And in addition to that, I am, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, I am a trained cartoonist. I'm a trained illustrator. I'm a trained cartoonist and illustrator. I'm a trained animator in my college years. Like, I know all the steps to making a full animation. I have illustrated stuff for projects before. I draw daily. And what that does for me as somebody talking to artists, I've done 3 of these interviews, actually 4 if you count the interview I did with Hiromi Wakabayashi and Hiroyuki Imaishi, which you can find over on, which is a written interview, but you can find it over on bento-box.ghost.io. And you can also find individual posts for the other 3 art interviews that I've recorded and put up here on YouTube or released as podcast if you're listening to this. What my creative background does for me when I'm talking to other creative people is it makes it less of a very narrow, controlled interview format and something that feels much more like a very specific conversation between 2 creative people. It's a conversation, it's less of a exploratory thing and more of a thing that looks a lot more like a conversation between peers, because that's what it is. And that's what it feels like to be someone who is considered to be a genius in who finds themselves in a group of their peers. A negative version of this is the mentor character in Good Will Hunting, who tried to bring up Matt Damon from the white trash ghetto-ness that he is in Southie Boston to being like a math prodigy. He finds Will and he tries to nurture him and get him to the next place, and he finds himself really frustrated because he can't relate to the character of Will that to Matt Damon's character in that movie, and that's why he sends Matt Damon to Robin Williams in that movie. But the thing I really like about the thing that struck me the most about The Secret Witch, and the thing that I thought about both as I was watching it, but also after I had finished it, was its depiction of genius as not being wholly solitary, despite Monica's desire for it to be at the very beginning. And they do that to such an extent that immediately after they tell you that Monica is this incredible witch who can use magic without incantations, they say, so she was enlisted as one of the 7 great sages. That means immediately there are 6 other people who are on the same level in a different way as her. And you meet 2 of them in the course of the show. You meet Louis the Berry Mage, and I forget the Star Sage's name, but she is actually she's actually the leader of the 7 sages. And what you see in her interactions with Louis and the Star Sage is that they look at her not as this incredible, awe-inspiring thing, but they look at her both as a peer, but very honestly. You're introduced to Monica by Louis just walking up to her cabin and being like, I got a job for you. get your shy ass out of this house and get in school, girl. And in addition to that, she kind of looks at them in the same way. You know, Lewis is straight up a wife guy. He's just a wife guy. He's not quite as much of a wife guy as, say, a Gendo Ikari, but he is a wife guy. He's completely obsessed with his wife and their soon-to-be kid. And the Star Sage, her kind of eccentricity is more related to her powers, to her, like, the form of magic she wields, and the way she uses it to essentially manipulate people. No, being able to see people's futures, and she just kind of, like, gently, or not so gently, pushes them along. And actually, it's a plot point in the show that the reason why Monica is guarding Felix is because the Star Sage can't see Felix's future. And that freaks everybody out. They're like, hey, the Truth Seer can't see the truth? We really need to make sure that this guy doesn't just die, because that would be bad. Because he is royalty. But my point is that, like I said, it's really easy to portray genius as this singular thing. But it's not really true. And this is a similarity that, like, the concept of genius has to creative genius, is that oftentimes people are encouraged to accept the bad in people if they have skill and ability, or people mistake it for talent, that is so overwhelming that it is undeniable and is considered to be valuable to society. A perfect example of this, and actually a great example of this if you're looking for one, is Don Draper from Mad Men. There's a great, I saw a great reel that's probably still floating around a couple days ago by an actual 1960s ad man. And it starts with him looking at the camera, and he just says, I think he's actually holding a sign that says, Don Draper was a womanizer and a talentless hack. And if you watch the show and strip away all the kind of, like, cool 1960s period fashion of the show, which is a lot of where it gets its kind of, like, coolness factor, the show is not trying to avoid that. Don Draper is only marginally better than the people around him. He's only resisted the kind of, like, racist, and he really only resisted part of the racism of the time just a little bit more than the people around him. And a lot of that is him doing a put-on, trying to play the good guy in a real way. And they reveal that for plot reasons later. But in the first episode of the show, I believe it's called "The Smoke Gets in Your Eyes," and much of the plot of the episode is Don Draper doesn't have anything for their big tobacco client who's coming in for a presentation on how to deal with the fact that the FDA has just declared cigarettes to be a major health risk and cause cancer and ultimately cause death, which we now know to be true. But in the 60s, they didn't know that until the FDA was like, nope, this is a thing. And he goes through this whole process where he really doesn't have anything, and somebody else, a character named Pete Campbell, I forget the actor who plays Pete Campbell's name, tries to muscle in and, like, take the glory, and not as a way of even really doing his job, but as a way of just stepping on Pete Campbell's throat in the room. Don Draper does this thing where he asks he asks how the cigarettes are made at Lucky Strike. And the junior executive in the room doesn't know. The senior executive, who's that junior executive's father, is like, shame on you, proceeds to tell them the whole process. And Don Draper just looks at the process for 5 seconds, and he picks a single word out of the process, and he says, Lucky Strikes are toasted. And he presents it with such confidence that it feels genius. But the Lucky Strike executive objects. And Don Draper immediately turns back on him and said, no. All other brands of cigarettes aren't toasted. All other brands of cigarettes are poisonous. Your Lucky Strikes are toasted. And like, standing ovation, adoration, impressed clients, whole thing. But it's not really that impressive. You stop and you think about it, and it's just not that impressive. And as a result, the show doesn't let him off the lens of the show doesn't let him off the hook, but the universe does. The universe treats Don as a visionary. The actual show feels him to be just as much of a shitbag as everybody else. If not, in some cases, worse, just in a different direction. And they show that later on in the show with his treatment of a female executive to a Jewish department store where they make all kinds of disparaging remarks about Jewish people and about women that are horrifying. And in the case of the remarks about women, the show tries to hold his feet to the fire on that, and does it somewhat successfully, but he still keeps on moving. My point is that in that case, the show is showing you someone who is tolerated because they are considered a genius. But it's also saying, but he's not really. And if you look at any kind of creative, artistic person who has had some kind of backslide, it's not that they don't have skill. And I'm not going to say that they have talent, because talent is kind of a fallacy, and we'll get to that in a second. It's that they have enough skill and insight for a brief period of time to outstrip the eccentricities that are objectionable. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, let's look at another pop culture icon, Kanye West. Before Kanye West was considered an insane, neo-Nazi, black neo-Nazi, he was considered to be one of the greatest producers and hip-hop artists of all times. He, by all accounts, went basically off the deep end, but also was revealed to just be an asshole who is taking advantage of people's tolerance of him not even because he was creatively gifted or skilled, but because he was a moneymaker. You can go look up a bunch of places, I'm sure, this kinds of stuff he did to board members at Adidas when he was in charge of Yeezys that are abhorrent. And at that like very core, he may have had some kind of subversive point, but the like application of it, insane, unhinged. And eventually, that crossed the line far enough where everybody was like, no, we're not dealing with this anymore. Weird, self-hating, racist bullshit. Get it out of here. And my point there is that there is a threshold where the eccentricities and faults of people who are exceptional in some way, or exceptionally skilled or talented in some way, are not tolerated. But oftentimes, that threshold is much closer to the bone for other people who have those skills. And in giving Monica Everett, the main character of the show, a group of her peers to play off of, to some extent, especially Lewis. Later on, the Star Sage, but especially Lewis. You get someone who's not here for her nonsense. Who understands that she has incredible social anxiety, but also has a way of dealing with it, and just kind of smiles and pushes past it. And it's like, yeah, I know that you don't love being around other people, but unfortunately, we live in a world, and we have to, and like, we all have a job to do. And there's a mild subtext here, and that is that Monica is capable of really exceptional things. Above and beyond even, Lewis or the Star Sage or so many other people around her. But she hasn't really been doing it. She's been essentially hiding in a mountain cabin and publishing, books. But there's stuff she could have been doing. And one of the antagonists in this first season is a character who suffered who suffered a huge loss of her family at the hands of a fire dragon. And they open the show up with a dragon attack. And they show you that Monica saves the Norton house from a dragon attack. The Norton house is actually the house whose name she's borrowing to enroll in the prestigious academy in the first place. And she saves those people. She saves that entire royal family's life. And they are like, ride or die for her. The daughter is like, I'm going to be your friend even if you don't want me to be. Level of ride and die for her. And idolizes her. But she wasn't around for the fire dragon attack that killed this other teenage girl who's essentially the same age as Monica. Or I think Monica's technically in her 20s, just looks young, but still. She wasn't there for... There are people who she wasn't there for. A lot of what you're seeing Monica do in this show is what she could have been doing the whole time. If the world had not been quite so tolerant of her just hiding away. And I think there's something like slightly interesting and subversive the show is saying about accepting the flaws of people who are deemed to be geniuses or talented at the expense of what they could be doing. The Lewis, the barrier sage, is like putting up protective barriers all over not only the kingdom, but you're led to believe the world, and, like, helping people protect themselves from, like, dragons and, all kinds of bad things. It's revealed that he puts up a barrier around the school that Monica ultimately, like, repurposes and uses to her own end to stop an assassination attempt by that girl whose parents were killed by the fire dragon. And the Star Sage uses her, like, future sight, uses her clairvoyance to also help the world, and they're both adequately rewarded for that stuff. They're both, like, basically every member of the Seven Sages is the equivalent of a star programmer in our real world. They get incredible compensation, they live incredible lives, and really even more than that, they're the equivalent of, like, a Brad Pitt or, like, an Angelina Jolie or, like, a famous actor, someone who's prized for their ability, essentially. And because their abilities are deemed useful and important. And the show is more or less quietly saying, like, hey, she could have been out doing this stuff. The world seems pretty messed up. And the show doesn't say that she, as I said in the summary section, the show doesn't say that she doesn't have her own deep-rooted trauma that her, like, malfunction is coming from. But it doesn't want to excuse her shyness and her anxiety as just a character quirk. Although it does get plenty of kind of, like, goofy bullshit out of it. It wants to kind of face that and be like, hey, you gotta live your life. You gotta move forward. You have to figure this out. And that, I really appreciate that treatment of genius, that understanding that, like, yes, you can be a gifted child, but no, you should not be allowed to have any kind of exceptions made for you just because. There's a difference between making exceptions for somebody who could be succeeding better if just the rules were bent to allow for a different kind of successful interaction with that system, and somebody who the rules are bent for because they are successful. And in this show, they are, like, especially Lewis, is just kind of staring at her and being like, I'm not gonna, I get it, you are deeply socially anxious, you have panic attacks out in public, I get it, but we need you to do this. Like, you're the person who's been deemed the right person to do this, and I'm not gonna not ask you just because you get butterflies in your stomach when you talk to a human being. Like, and I'm not trying to say that you should always say to people who have social anxiety to, like, nut up and shut up. But there's a tendency to, and I can speak to this as a disabled person, this tendency with people who have some form of disorder or disability in some way to allow them to reach for less. To allow them to not just make room for them, to not just, make something less ableist, but to kind of baby people like that, and in some cases characters like that, to an extent that there's no opportunity for growth. I'm going to tell a personal story here. I grew up, I'm actually disabled, if you didn't know by now, and I've talked about that on the podcast before. But I grew up disabled. I've been disabled since birth, essentially. But when I was growing up and going through public school, I went through public school with other disabled kids and people. And there was one, and I'm not going to say their name, but there was one particular other person who was always on the same track as me. But there was a very different approach to their parents' handling of their life. I'm not going to say this wrong, but it was different. And as a result, when in the way that I was able to grow kind of healthily and become pretty self-sufficient and incredibly capable and independent, this other person wasn't. And you look at the way I was encouraged to go for things and the way that it wasn't an acceptable answer. Was not an acceptable answer without some form of exploration into whether or not that was really true. I was never allowed to be let off the hook just because I was physically disabled. And what that did for me is it made me understand, like, I can reach for things. I should reach for things. It's not beyond me to go for it. And as a result, very often a thing that happens with all of my friends is eventually at some point they just forget I'm disabled, and this oftentimes looks like I only have one hand, but I already have something in my one hand, and they go to hand me something else, and there's this delightfully, awesomely awkward moment where they're like, "Oh shit, I'm so sorry." And I'm just like, "No, it's fine. It's fine. That's a good thing. I can't take that, whatever you're holding, but that's a good thing." You've moved past the point at which you recognize that part of me. That's awesome for everybody involved. And that only happened because I was allowed to reach beyond my physical disability and my medical history and all of that stuff. And yes, it's a part of me and it's part of my life, but it's not the singular defining thing. It may be a big thing, it may be a thing that, like, I carry with me all the time, but it's not the thing that wholly defines me. And to bring it back to the Silent Witch, in Monica's kind of like arc as a character, you see her emotional intelligence develop differently and approach things differently because she has this unique social awareness that is different and holds things at a different level of importance than the people around her. She holds her interactions with a different level of importance and with fear than the people around her. So she just did a scene where she's supposed to, where these girls are hazing her and she's supposed to drink this tea and spit it out because it's too bitter. But she just drinks it and almost dies, but just drinks it. And everybody freaks out. And there's a moment at which the girls are made to, by the house that Monica's borrowing the name of, drink some of that same tea with the same ingredient that makes it essentially poisonous in it, and they can't make it through it. They can't make it through the cup. And that makes them understand truly what they were doing, truly the danger of what they were doing, in a way that, like, they didn't recognize it because it was just hazing to them. It was just them bullying somebody. And very often, people who don't ascribe the same level of importance to social interaction don't get that. But the whole show feels like this. It feels like that. It has that vibe and thought process behind it, where it is about genius, but it's also about not letting geniuses off the hook for their eccentricities, and about encouraging people with disorders to reach for more than maybe they think they're capable of, because they'll be surprised at what they find in themselves. And I think that's a really interesting, important thing. Even if the actual show isn't always completely the best thing on earth. And on that note, that's actually where I'm going to leave it. So, hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast, and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.